Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar covering the mixed methodology chapter. And just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to provide this information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we are a full service a dissertation assistance company, so we provide help with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you do need help outside of this webinar and are interested in getting additional help, you can contact us using the information that you see here to learn more about what kind of assistance we can provide. So I'll start with just an overview of what we are going to be discussing today, which is the components of the mixed methodology chapter. We'll first talk about what the purpose of the methodology chapter is and why it's important to the dissertation. And then we'll talk about the different components of the methodology chapter, specifically in regards to a mixed methodology. So we'll go through things like the introduction, research design, role of the researcher, population, sample and setting, instruments, data collection and analysis procedures, validity, and ethical concerns. And then at the end, we'll have time to answer your questions. So if you do have questions, you can feel free to type those into the questions section. And then any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, we will have a chance to answer those at the end. So just to let you know, we will be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. So before we get into the components, let's just talk about the methodology chapter generally and what purpose it serves. So the methodology chapter describes how you will be conducting your research. In the chapters that precede the methodology, namely the introduction and literature review, you're talking mainly about why you are conducting your research. When you get to the methodology chapter, now is the time to start talking about how you will carry out your research. So the methodology chapter should be detailed enough that your research can be replicated by others. So you want your write-up of your methodology to be so detailed that another researcher could read it and they would be able to conduct the study in the exact same way that you did. So you can think of your methodology chapter almost like an instruction manual. Think of that you are writing an instruction manual for how to conduct your study. You can also, other people will use the analogy of a recipe to where you talk about the different ingredients of your study. So for instance, the different instruments that you're going to use, the participants that you'll be studying, and then the recipe itself for how all those things come together. So how will you sample the participants? How will you administer the instruments? So you can think of it in terms of a recipe or a set of steps that you follow to conduct your study. And while today we will be talking about the content that is typically required or found in a mixed methodology chapter, you do want to double check your school guidelines to know specifically what your school or degree program requires for the methodology chapter. Because sometimes, all degree programs in schools will have different guidelines. So sometimes they will have different sections that they require. There may be some schools that have sections that they require that aren't discussed here. Some may not require all of the sections that we discuss here. So just keep in mind that while you can use this webinar as a general guide for what is typically included in the methodology chapter, you do want to double check your school guidelines to see exactly what's required of you. And then a final note is that this webinar will be specific to mixed methodology. So we'll generally be discussing the issues that come with having both a quantitative and qualitative component to your study and how you bring those components together in your methodology. But if you want more specific information on specifically the quantitative aspect of the methods, or specifically the qualitative aspect of the methods, then you can find more information in our other webinars that covered those topics more in depth. So now let's start talking about the components of the methodology. And starting with the introduction. Usually the introduction is just a brief restatement of your purpose or problem statement to reorient the reader to the purpose of the study. And then you want to also restate your research questions and hypotheses. For the quantitative aspect of your study, you will typically have specific hypotheses that you're testing. You may be required to write those out in null and alternative format. But for the qualitative aspect of your study, those generally will not have hypotheses and will just have research questions. And then you can just simply preview or outline the different sections that will be included in the methodology chapter. And really, this is just as simple as listing out the different section headings and content that will appear in the chapter, so that you just give the reader a preview of what is going to be in the chapter. Following the introduction, you typically talk about the research design, and there are special considerations for this section, specifically for a mixed method study. First of all, you want to define the phenomenon or the case that you are studying. And this speaks more to the qualitative aspect of your study, because in a qualitative study, you're studying some kind of phenomenon, or if you're doing specifically a case study, you might be studying a specific case. So you want to define that in your research design section. And then crucially, you want to explain why a mixed method was selected over either a qualitative or a quantitative method alone. This is very important if you are going to undertake a mixed method study, because you do have to provide strong justification for why both quantitative and qualitative data are needed, as opposed to just collecting quantitative data or just collecting qualitative data. You need to provide your rationale for why you're doing this, and you need to make a good case for why it's necessary to have both of these components to your study. Because if you can't make a good case for it, then you probably should just be doing either a quantitative study or a qualitative study. Now, after you've justified why you need a mixed method to answer your research aims, you want to state the specific research design for each component of your study, if applicable. So for quantitative, the different types of research designs that you may have include descriptive, correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, or causal comparative, just to name a few. And then for qualitative, you might have something like a generic qualitative study, descriptive, phenomenology, case study. There's also ethnography or grounded theory, but generally, if you're doing a mixed method study, you may not be so much going into something like an ethnography or grounded theory. Generally, in mixed method study, you're probably looking at something more like a generic qualitative approach or a descriptive approach. And once you've defined those, you also want to explain and justify the approach for integrating the quantitative and the qualitative data. So when you do a mixed method study, you have to have some kind of plan for how the two components of your study are going to help you answer your research questions and address the aims of your study. And this will involve incorporating those two forms of data, the quantitative data and the qualitative data, in order to answer your research questions. So here you'll want to talk about how exactly that's going to happen and justify the approach for doing it. So in some mixed method studies, for instance, you might start with some preliminary qualitative research where you collect some qualitative data, and then that in turn informs your quantitative data collection. Or less often, but you could also have the reverse, where you start with a simple quantitative study, and that maybe informs a qualitative component of data collection. Or you sometimes collect both forms of data at the same time or in an iterative process and incorporate both forms of data simultaneously into your interpretation and addressing of the research questions. So there are a lot of different approaches that you can take, and it will really depend on the specific research designs you select for each component and the specific aims that you are trying to address in your study. But whatever you choose to do, you will have to justify your approach for how you bring those sources of data together to answer your research aims. So now let's talk about the role of the researcher, and this speaks more to the qualitative aspect of the study. And you first want to explain or define what your role is going to be in the study. So generally, this falls into either an observer or an observer participant. If you're an observer, you're just collecting the data or observing the phenomenon that you're studying. Whereas if you're an observer participant, you as the researcher are also engaging with the phenomenon or the case or the culture that you're studying. This is seen more in things like ethnography or ethnographic research, where as a participant, you are living in the culture that you're studying and engaging with the culture actively rather than just observing and taking notes. You also want to explain your relationship with the phenomenon, the setting, and the participants. So, for instance, if you are doing a study in education and you are a principal and you're doing the study at the school that you are the principal of, you will want to explain your relationship to those participants, the school, and the specific phenomenon that you're studying in regards to education. As you can imagine, if you are doing a qualitative aspect to your study, it probably is because you have some kind of personal or professional connection to the phenomenon or the topic or the concept that you're studying. So it's likely that you have some kind of personal or professional connection to the area that you are studying. So you just want to explain what that is. And with those connections comes things like biases, power differentials in relationships that you may have with participants, and things like conflicts of interest. So, you can imagine if you're a principal at a school and you're conducting your study at that school, you definitely have things like, power differentials with your participants and conflicts of interest that you will need to manage as you conduct that study. Another example might be if you are a nurse manager and you are conducting your study in your hospital among the nurses in the hospital. So if there is some kind of power relationship or power differential that you have with the participants, or any kind of bias or conflicts of interest that could potentially pop up, you need to explain how those will be managed. So related to the role of the researcher is the population, sample, and setting, but this applies both to the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of the study. So you'll want to describe the setting or the population of interest. The population refers more to the quantitative aspect if you intend to generalize results to a broader population. But otherwise, you can describe the general group of people or the setting that you are examining in your study. And you'll want to describe your sampling strategy or technique that you will use in your study. And you want to do this for each component. if that is applicable. Because sometimes you will have a different sampling strategy for collecting your quantitative data as opposed to your qualitative data, because you might be sampling a different group of people for the quantitative part versus the qualitative part. So for each component, if you do have different sampling strategies or procedures for each part of your study, you will want to explain those separately. You'll want to describe how eligible individuals from your setting or population will be identified and invited to participate. So if you have a general setting or group of people that you're studying, how are you going to identify people from that setting to participate in your study? What characteristics do they need to make them eligible? And for instance, in most qualitative research, you will probably be using some kind of purposive sampling technique where you are collecting data from participants and choosing participants based on certain qualifications or characteristics that they may have that would make them ideal for giving you data that can answer your research questions. So if you do have some kind of eligibility criteria or specific characteristics that you're looking for in your participants that they will need in order to provide you with the appropriate data, you'll need to explain what that eligibility criteria is. And you'll also want to talk about the sample size for your study. So you'll want to be able to estimate or calculate the target sample size for each component of your data collection. And these processes are very different for quantitative versus qualitative data. For quantitative data, you'll probably need to do a power analysis depending on the specific analysis that you intend to conduct. A power analysis will reveal specifically how many participants you need for a specific type of statistical analysis. Whereas in qualitative research, it's less direct and objective in terms of determining an appropriate sample size. In qualitative research, you often determine sample size based on data saturation, which is the concept of, as you're collecting qualitative data, at what point do additional data not provide any additional information or insights into answering your research questions? Once you reach the point where you find that your interview participants are all kind of saying the same thing, or they're repeating things that you've already heard other participants tell you, that's a good sign that you're getting close to data saturation, where interviewing more participants is not going to add anything more to the data that you already have. And there are different guidelines in the qualitative literature that specify what's an appropriate number of participants to shoot for to reach data saturation. And you'll want to cite those qualitative scholars in making your sample size estimates for that part of your study. So now let's talk about instrumentation. And instrumentation just refers to the different tools or measurements that you're going to use for each component of your data collection. So you want to state the instruments that you're going to be using for each part, both the quantitative and the qualitative. Specifically for quantitative instruments, you might have something like a quantitative survey. And if you do, then you'll want to provide as much detail as you can about that survey. So how many items or questions will it have? What type of response scale will the participants use when answering those questions? So for instance, you may be administering some kind of instrument that has 10 questions and participants respond to it using a Likert scale. So they might rate it from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a 5 or a 7-point scale, for instance. You'll want to describe that in detail. You'll also want to describe how the instrument is scored. And you'll want to provide evidence of the validity and reliability of any quantitative instruments that you're using. So generally, for quantitative instruments, you'll likely be using an instrument that has already been developed in the research and validated. And so you will want to look up the information in the literature about the development of the instrument and provide evidence that the instrument is valid and reliable. If you happen to be in the situation where you need to develop your own instrument for your mixed method study, and this can happen if, for instance, you do your qualitative data collection first, and that informs the quantitative part of your study. And as part of that, you need to develop a quantitative instrument based on what you found in the qualitative part of the study. Then you might have to create your own instrument, in which case you would have to develop a plan for demonstrating that that instrument is valid and reliable. So if you do have to create your own instrument, you will have to have an additional component to the study where you talk about how exactly you're going to test and establish validity and reliability for the instrument that you have created. And then for qualitative instruments, this refers more to things like interview protocols or protocols for things like focus groups. So you'll want to talk about how the protocol was developed. And usually for qualitative studies, you will be developing your own protocol, although in some cases you may use protocols that other researchers have used in the past. And if you're developing your own protocol, then this will often require field testing or a pilot test of your protocol. So you'll want to describe the details of how you're going to develop your interview protocol and any testing that may be necessary in the development of that protocol. You'll want to talk about the number of questions that you're going to ask and the nature of the interview itself. So for instance, you may be conducting a semi-structured interview where you have a set of questions that you ask, but you also may kind of go off the script a little bit in order to probe participants for additional information. If a participant mentions something particularly interesting, you may ask a follow-up question to get more information or things like that. So that would be an example of a semi-structured type of interview where you have a set of questions, but you can also ask follow-up questions and go off of the script a little bit to get the information that you need. This is as opposed to a strict structured interview where you just ask the questions that you have listed and you don't go off script. And then for your qualitative instruments, you also want to talk about how your data will be recorded. So if you're doing interviews, are you going to use audio recordings? If so, what device or devices are you going to use for those audio recordings? Are you going to be taking notes? Things like that. So you want to describe all of those things in your instrumentation section. So once you've established what instruments you're going to be using, you'll want to talk about how the process that you're going to go through to actually collect the data and use those instruments to collect the data. So going back to our earlier discussion of being as detailed as possible, you want to describe step by step how the data are going to be collected. And with this in mind, you want this section to be detailed enough so that another person could read your methodology section and be able to replicate your study or carry out your study exactly the way that you are conducting it. So you want to talk about both where and how each component of the data collection will take place. So for instance, if you're sending out a survey or having people complete a quantitative survey, is this going to be in person or online? If you're doing interviews for your qualitative portion, are you going to be doing the interviews in person or over the phone, or doing some kind of a virtual meeting, like a Zoom meeting, to do your interviews? You'll want to be as specific as possible. You'll want to talk about how participants are going to provide informed consent. So, in all studies, your participants will need to provide informed consent. So you'll need to talk about when they're going to get the information or the informed consent form, and how they will be providing their consent to participate in the study. And then you'll also want to specify how, when, and to whom each instrument or protocol is going to be administered. Because if you have both a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to your study, you might be collecting data from different groups of participants. You might have one group of participants who you're only giving the quantitative instruments to, another group of participants who you are only interviewing, or maybe you're both interviewing and giving your quantitative survey to the same participants. If that's the case, you want to specify that. So you'll want to be very specific in describing who is going to get what instrument and in what order is this going to happen. So again, this goes back to the issue of how you're going to collect your data and integrate the data together. So if you're doing your data in a process where you do your qualitative collection first and then you do your quantitative, you'll want to specify that it's occurring in that order. Or if you are doing it as kind of an iterative process where the qualitative and the quantitative data occur somewhat simultaneously, then you'll want to describe that process as well. And then in addition to the data collection procedures, you'll also want to describe your plan for the data analysis. So first, and this applies to both qualitative and quantitative data, you want to describe how you're going to take the data and compile it or enter it into an electronic format. As these days, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research, your data is going to have to go into an electronic format at some point, whether, for quantitative, it's in a spreadsheet, or for qualitative, it's in, electronic text documents. You will want to specify how exactly those electronic files are going to be compiled or created. So specifically for qualitative and considerations for that, so things like interviews, if you have an audio recording of your interviews, you'll want to describe how you're going to take that audio recording and get it transcribed into a text format that you can then code and analyze. So if you're using a specific software for transcription, or you're using some kind of professional transcription service in order to transcribe your interviews, you'll want to specify that. And then there are going to be specific procedures for each type of data analysis that you're doing. So starting with quantitative, you'll want to, of course, state the software that you're using. So you might be using something like SPSS for your quantitative analysis. You'll want to describe how you're going to clean or prepare the data for analysis. So this can involve talking about how you're going to deal with missing responses, how you're going to check the data to make sure it was entered accurately and you don't have any outliers in your data, or if you need to code or compute any variables from the instruments that you used, then you would describe that process. You'll want to talk about any descriptive conduct on quantitative data and describe the analyses that you're going to conduct to answer each research question or hypothesis for the quantitative component. of your study. And then for each analysis that you're proposing, you may need to test certain statistical assumptions for that analysis. So for instance, if you're doing something like an analysis of variance, you may need to test normality and homogeneity of variance. So you'll want to list specifically what assumptions are required for each statistical analysis and how you're going to test each of those assumptions. For the qualitative aspect of data analysis, this is a little bit different from quantitative in that you may be using software to help you with the analysis, but it's not like quantitative analysis where you put in your variables and the software will run an analysis for you. For qualitative, you can use a software like NVivo to help you organize your qualitative data and facilitate your coding and analysis of the data. But for qualitative analysis, you can't really use software that will do the coding or analysis for you. The software is more just to help facilitate your analysis of the data. So if you are using a program like NVivo to help with that process, you'll want to state that. And you'll also want to describe and justify the coding or analysis procedure that you will be using to analyze the qualitative data. So this might be something like thematic analysis. So if you're going to follow thematic analysis as an analytic procedure for your qualitative data, you want to describe the different steps of thematic analysis and how that's going to apply to your data. And then importantly, you'll want to describe how the different sources of data, so the quantitative and the qualitative, will be integrated or triangulated to answer your research questions. Again, this will really vary depending on exactly how you're setting up your study. Going back to what we talked about in the research design, are you doing the qualitative part first and that's informing the quantitative, or maybe the opposite? Are you doing the quantitative first and then the qualitative? Or are you collecting both sources of data at the same time and are using both sources of data to answer the same research questions? If that's the case, you need to describe how exactly you're going to integrate those two data sources together and use them to answer the research questions. So that covers the instrumentation and the data collection and analysis procedures. And so the closing of the methodology chapter gets into things like validity, trustworthiness, and ethical considerations. So we can start with validity. And so for the quantitative aspect of your study, you want to list the different limitations or validity concerns that are associated with your specific quantitative research design. So for instance, if you're doing a correlational research design for your quantitative portion, a limitation might be that you can't determine cause and effect. If you're doing quantitative survey research, you might talk about how a limitation is that there are different response biases that could be present in survey responses. If you're doing some kind of longitudinal or repeated measure study, you might talk about things like attrition, testing effects, history, or maturation as limitations or potential threats to the validity for the quantitative data. And then for the qualitative aspect, qualitative also has its own version of validity, which is often called trustworthiness. And here you will want to discuss the issues of trustworthiness that are related to your specific qualitative research design. And there are 4 general aspects of trustworthiness that are typically discussed for qualitative research. Those include credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And so you generally want to talk about each aspect of trustworthiness and how you are going to address it in your study. And different ways to address trustworthiness and qualitative research might involve things like, conducting audit trails of your data, doing member checking, having multiple raters code the data and cross-reference each other. So there are a lot of different approaches that you can take to ensure trustworthiness, and you'll want to describe that as part of your discussion of trustworthiness for your specific study. And again, if you're interested in more detailed information specifically on trustworthiness and qualitative research, you can look to our other webinars and resources that look specifically at qualitative methodology. So finally, you'll want to discuss the ethical considerations that are involved in your research. And often this involves discussing the Belmont Report Principles. There are 3 general principles that are usually discussed, which is justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. So often it's required to talk about these principles and talk about how you will ensure each of those principles are followed as you conduct your research. You'll want to talk about IRB or Institutional Review Board approval and different site permissions that you may need to conduct your research. So you'll definitely need to get approval from your school IRB in order to conduct your research, but you also may need permission from the specific setting or organizations that you are collaborating with to conduct your study. So you may need different site permissions or permissions from organizations to get approval to conduct your research, and you want to describe that in this section. And you'll also want to talk about your informed consent process. I mean, you'll probably talk about that a little bit in your data collection procedures, but it's also worth talking about here. So you want to talk about the consent process, how participants will be provided information about the study, how they'll be given an opportunity to ask questions, understand what's involved in the study, and make an informed decision to participate or to not participate. You'll want to talk about the risks that are involved in your study. So are the risks going to be minimal, or are they going to be more than minimal? You never want to say that there are no risks involved in the study, because there's at least some risk involved in all research, even if you're doing something relatively innocuous, like just having someone fill out a survey. There's still some risk involved in that. But generally, you can classify studies as having minimal risk. So if you're doing something very simple like surveys, your study might have minimal risk, or more than minimal risk, where you may be doing something more involved, where participants' privacy, or maybe even their physical or psychological well-being may have more of a risk. So especially if your study involves more than minimal risks, you do want to talk about the risks that are involved in the study and how you're going to mitigate those risks as much as possible. You'll want to talk about things like how participants' identities and information are going to be protected. So you'll want to talk about issues such as anonymity and confidentiality. Generally, in qualitative data collection, it's hard for participants to be completely anonymous, because if you're going to be sitting down and interviewing participants, you'll know who those people are, but you should still take steps to ensure that their data are going to be protected and kept confidential. So for qualitative research, you might do things like assign participants pseudonyms or participant identification numbers, and use that as you are analyzing and reporting your data so that you're not using participants' real names in your reports. And finally, you want to talk about how you're going to be protecting the data. So specifically how the data are going to be stored. If you have electronic copies of the data, you want to talk about things like storing them on password protected computers or encrypted cloud storage, or if you have actual physical copies of the data, such as, if when you collected qualitative data, if you took notes, or if people filled out paper and pencil surveys, you'll want to discuss how you're going to be storing and securing physical copies of data. And then how will the data be destroyed after the study is over? Generally, schools will have guidelines for how long you should keep the data after your study is done with, and recommendations for when you should dispose of the data after the study is completed. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, covering the different components of the mixed methodology chapter. Again, you can see our information here to contact us if you're interested in additional support outside of these webinars. And with that, I will get to the question portion of our webinar. So if you do have questions, you can feel free to post those in the question section now. Let me just see if we have any questions already. And I see one question is there a need to include population and sampling in a research proposal where you intend to collect information from secondary data? So this is kind of a good point in that, sometimes you might be using data that somebody already collected or is already existing, or so in other words, secondary data. You still want to describe things like, what is your specific process for obtaining that data? So are the data just publicly available and you just have to go to a website to obtain the data, or are the data managed or administered by a certain organization and you have to collaborate with that organization in order to have access to the data? So if that's the case, then you will want to describe the procedures that you need to follow in order to access and use the data for research. Sometimes it's also appropriate to briefly talk about how the data were originally collected. Generally, you don't need to be super detailed if the data are secondary data in terms of how they were originally collected, but sometimes you will want to describe that process. So basically the short answer to the question is, yes, you still need to talk about things like the population and the sampling and the data collection procedures when you're using secondary data, but it applies more to how you are going to be obtaining that data and how were the data originally collected. Okay, so another question I have here is, written interview valid for a qualitative research design? Well, the thing, I don't know if I'd necessarily use the word valid, because there are lots of different ways that you can collect qualitative data. It doesn't have to be sitting down and interviewing somebody and getting their the audio recording of the interview. It can be things like just open-ended responses on an online survey. I think that's more towards the written part that you're describing. Or it could be something like you send participants a list of questions and then they write down their responses. So it doesn't just have to involve interviewing where you sit down and actually talk to someone. It's really just, qualitative data can be any kind of textual data that the participants provide, whether it's by talking to you or just writing down their thoughts or experiences. So that is another way that you can collect data in a qualitative study. Right, so if someone wants to go back to the data analysis plan section, so I'll go ahead and bring that slide back up. And also, just as a note, these slides will be available after the presentation. So you will have access to a copy of the slide as well as a recording of the webinar. So if you missed something or want to go back or look at the slides, you will have access to a copy of the slides. And let's see if we have more questions here. So one question is, convenience sample is always considered a problem in terms of generalizability, just as some journal reviewers said. However, there are many studies that employ convenience samples, such as students. So under what circumstances is a convenience sample accepted? So convenience sampling is typically done when it is not feasible to do some kind of probability-based sampling procedure, which ends up being the case in a lot of studies. So, for instance, in a true, probability sampling, random sampling procedure, every single individual in the population would have an equal chance of being selected into your study. Well, depending on the population that you're looking at, it's probably not going to be feasible for you to ensure that every single individual in the population has an opportunity to participate in your study. You're mostly going to be looking at a subset of that population or a target population that is representative, presumably, of that more general population that you end up sampling from. So really, the non-probability sampling techniques like convenience sampling are used when it's just not feasible to conduct a random sampling procedure. And in terms of qualitative research, generally in qualitative research, you are not necessarily looking to generalize your results to a large population. You're looking at more of a specific setting or phenomenon. So if you're doing something like purposive sampling in your qualitative data collection, then you really don't even have to worry about things like generalizability of the sample or representativeness, because with your specific sampling technique in qualitative, you are specifically looking for participants who are going to give you the data you need to answer your research questions. So it's for qualitative, it's less of an issue of generalizability. So the next question I have here is, what are the considerations about small sample size for equal N between qualitative and quantitative data sets using the same sample for both? So I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you're asking, but it's if you're asking if the qualitative and the quantitative sample sizes need to be the same or need to be equal, the answer to that is no. The sample size for both the quantitative and the qualitative aspect will be dependent on your specific analysis procedures for each component of the study. So again, for quantitative data, you need to consider what specific quantitative analysis you're going to be conducting for the quantitative portion, and doing something like a power analysis to determine the appropriate number of participants for the specific quantitative analysis that you're choosing. So for instance, you might use a power analysis to determine how many participants you need for a t-test, or how many participants you need for an ANOVA or for a regression. For qualitative, it's different. And generally for qualitative, you don't need nearly as many participants as you do for quantitative. Again, qualitative is determined more by data saturation, and at what point are you reaching data saturation? At what point are new data not providing you any more insights that you haven't already discovered from the data that you already collected? And there are general guidelines for how many participants you'll need to reach data saturation. So and that can range anywhere from 10 to 20 participants, depending on what qualitative method scholar you're reading or referencing for that recommendation. But generally, the qualitative component will have a lower sample size than the qualitative component will have a lower sample size than the quantitative component, and they don't necessarily have to be equal. And yes, there was another page to the data analysis plan, so I'll put that up there. But again, as we said, the slides will be available for you to download after the webinar is over. So if you want to go back and review the slides or have a copy of the slides, that will be available to you. And it looks like those are all the questions that have been entered so far. So if anyone has any additional questions, go ahead and put those in now, and I'll give it another minute or so for anyone to ask any additional questions before we end our presentation today. Okay, okay, let me see. One more question here. For semi-structured interviews, which software is the best? I guess it depends on exactly what you want to use the software for. So there may be software to use for audio recording your interview, or software to use for the data analysis once the interview is transcribed and you're ready to code it, or software for transcription. So I guess it depends on exactly what you're looking at. I don't have any specific recommendations for audio recording or transcription. For transcription, you're probably best off looking into a professional service so that you ensure that your transcription is done as accurately as possible. For audio recording, something like if you're doing a Zoom conference, a lot of those programs will just automatically record for you. But in terms of the data analysis and the best programs for helping facilitate coding and organization of the data, NVivo is probably the most common that people will use. There are also other programs. Deduce is another program that people will use for qualitative data analysis. So there are different options available. And again, it depends on exactly what software you or what you need the software to do, whether it's to help with the data analysis or the recording or what part you're specifically looking at. Right. And if it's, just to follow up on that question, if it is the software for data analysis, again, NVivo is probably the most common that people will use, and Deduce is another program that people will use for qualitative data analysis. And it looks like those are all the questions that have been posted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the session there. Again, you can use the information that you see here to contact us in case you are interested in additional help. And you're also welcome to attend webinars that we have on other topics. So specifically, if you're interested in more detailed information on quantitative methods or qualitative methods specifically, we have webinars that cover those topics. But otherwise, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. I hope everyone found it useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.